They told me I was too delicate for war. Too soft. Too fragile. My hands, they said, were made for piano keys and embroidery needles, not for the brutal realities of a battlefield. But when the bombs started falling on our city, when the screams of dying men echoed through streets I'd walked my entire life, I discovered something about myself that no one, not even I, knew existed. If you've ever been underestimated, if someone has ever looked at you and decided you weren't strong enough before you even had the chance to prove yourself, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is the story of how I became someone I never imagined I could be. My name is Dorothy Mae Harrison, and I was 23 years old when the world as I knew it ended. It was December 1941, and I was living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, New York, with my mother and younger sister, Evelyn. The apartment building was one of those red brick structures that lined the streets like dominoes, each one identical to the next, with fire escapes zigzagging down the facades like metal veins. Our apartment was on the 3rd floor, and from our kitchen window, you could see the corner grocery store where Mr. Kowalski sold day-old bread at a discount and always slipped an extra apple into our bag when times were particularly tight. I worked as a secretary at a law firm in Manhattan, taking the subway every morning at 7:15 sharp. The train would rattle and screech through the tunnels, packed with bodies pressed against bodies, the smell of coffee and cigarettes and cheap perfume mixing into something distinctly urban, distinctly alive. I'd emerge at my stop and walk 4 blocks to the office, my heels clicking against the pavement in rhythm with hundreds of other working women, all of us in our modest dresses and carefully pinned hair, all of us trying to make something of ourselves in a world that kept telling us our place was at home. My father had died 3 years earlier, a heart attack that took him suddenly one Tuesday evening while he was reading the newspaper in his favorite armchair. He simply closed his eyes and never opened them again. After that, I became the primary breadwinner for our small family. My mother took in sewing work when she could, her fingers moving with practiced precision over fabric, creating beautiful things from scraps and remnants. Evelyn was 17 and still in high school, dreaming of becoming a teacher, her nose always buried in books, her mind somewhere far beyond our cramped apartment and the limitations of our circumstances. Life was predictable then. Difficult, yes, but predictable. I knew what each day would bring. I knew that Mr. Patterson, the senior partner at the firm, would need his coffee at exactly 8:30, black with 1 sugar. I knew that Miss Thornton from accounting would spend her lunch hour complaining about her mother-in-law. I knew that I'd return home each evening to find my mother at the sewing machine and Evelyn at the kitchen table with her homework spread out like a paper landscape. There was comfort in that predictability, even if there was also a certain suffocating quality to it, a sense that life was happening somewhere else to someone else, and I was just watching it pass by through a window. Then came December 7th, Pearl Harbor. I remember exactly where I was when I heard the news. I was at Rosie's Diner on 5th Avenue, meeting my friend Catherine for Sunday brunch. The radio was playing big band music, something cheerful and bright, and we were laughing about something trivial, something I can't even remember now. Then the music stopped. The announcer's voice came through, tight and strained, and the words he spoke seemed impossible, like something from a radio drama, not real life. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. We were at war. The diner went silent. Completely, utterly silent. You could hear the coffee percolating behind the counter, the sizzle of bacon on the griddle. Then someone dropped a plate, and the crash seemed to break the spell. Suddenly everyone was talking at once, voices rising in confusion and fear and anger. Catherine grabbed my hand across the table, her fingers cold and trembling. Her brother was stationed in Hawaii. We didn't know then if he was alive or dead. We wouldn't know for 3 agonizing weeks. Everything changed after that. The city transformed almost overnight. Recruitment posters appeared on every corner, Uncle Sam pointing his finger, demanding that we do our part. Young men lined up at recruitment offices, some eager, some terrified, all of them trying to look brave. The women left behind took their places in factories and offices, filling roles that had been closed to us before. Rosie the Riveter became more than a poster. She became all of us, rolling up our sleeves and discovering capabilities we'd been told we didn't possess. I wanted to do more than type letters and file documents. I wanted to contribute something meaningful, something that mattered. I'd always been drawn to medicine, had always been the one in our family who bandaged scraped knees and nursed sick relatives, but nursing school had been financially impossible after my father died. Now, with the war creating desperate shortages of medical personnel, the Red Cross was offering accelerated training programs for nurses' aides. I applied immediately. My mother was horrified. "Dorothy, you can't be serious," she said, her face pale as I showed her the acceptance letter. "It's dangerous. You're all I have left. If something happened to you." Her voice trailed off, but I could hear all the unspoken fears, all the terrible possibilities that kept her awake at night. "Nothing's going to happen to me, Mama," I told her, though I had no way of knowing if that was true. "I'll be here in New York. I'll be helping at the hospitals. I'll be safe." But I wasn't entirely honest with her. The training program included preparation for overseas deployment. They needed nurses and aides in the field hospitals, in the combat zones, where the need was greatest and the danger was real. I told myself I probably wouldn't be selected, that they'd keep me stateside, but deep down I knew I wanted to go. I wanted to be where I could make the most difference, even if that meant putting myself in harm's way. The training was intense. We learned how to dress wounds, how to administer medications, how to triage casualties when resources were limited, and every decision meant choosing who might live and who might die. We learned how to work under pressure, how to function when we were exhausted and terrified and surrounded by suffering. They taught us to be efficient, to be calm, to be strong. They taught us to ignore our own fear and focus on the person in front of us who needed help. I was good at it, better than I expected. My hands, those supposedly delicate hands that were meant for gentler pursuits, proved steady and capable. I could insert an 4 on the first try. I could clean and dress a wound without flinching. I could hold the hand of a dying soldier and give him comfort in his final moments without falling apart until later, until I was alone and could afford to feel the weight of what I'd witnessed. 6 months into my training, I received my orders. I was being deployed to England, to a field hospital that would move with the troops as they advanced across Europe. We'd be close to the front lines, close enough to hear the artillery, close enough that the wounded could reach us quickly, before they bled out or went into shock, close enough to be in danger ourselves. I told my mother the night before I left. I couldn't bring myself to tell her earlier, couldn't bear to see the fear in her eyes for weeks on end. She cried as I knew she would. She held me so tightly I could barely breathe, and she made me promise to come home, to be careful, to remember that I was loved and needed. Evelyn cried too, but she also looked at me with something like awe, like I was doing something brave and important, and that look gave me strength when my own courage faltered. The crossing to England was rough. The Atlantic in winter is unforgiving, all grey waves and bitter wind. We traveled in a convoy, surrounded by naval destroyers, always watching for German U-boats. The ship rolled and pitched, and most of us were sick for days. We huddled in our bunks below deck, listening to the groan of the hull, wondering if every strange sound was a torpedo coming to send us to the bottom of the ocean. But we made it. After 2 weeks at sea, we saw the coast of England emerging from the mist, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. I was really here. This was really happening. England in 1942 was a country under siege. The Blitz had ended, but the scars remained. In London, entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Buildings stood like broken teeth, their facades blown away to reveal the intimate details of the lives that had been lived inside them. A bathtub hanging from a third-floor wall. Wallpaper with faded flowers. A child's toy sitting in the debris. The British people moved through this devastation with a kind of determined normalcy, going about their business, refusing to be broken. Their resilience was inspiring and heartbreaking in equal measure. We were stationed initially at a hospital in Southampton, a port city on the southern coast. The hospital was a converted manor house, grand and elegant once, now filled with rows of metal beds and the smell of disinfectant and blood. The wounded came in waves, brought back from raids across the channel, from training accidents, from the constant low-level violence of a world at war. We worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer when casualties were heavy. We worked until our feet ached and our backs screamed and our hands were raw from constant washing. I learned things there that no training could have prepared me for. I learned what a human body looks like when it's been torn apart by shrapnel. I learned the particular smell of gangrene, sweet and rotten. I learned how to tell when someone was going to die, a certain look in their eyes, a certain quality to their breathing. I learned how to harden myself enough to function while still remaining human enough to care. It was a delicate balance, and I didn't always manage it. There were nights when I'd finish my shift and go to the small room I shared with 3 other nurses and cry until I had nothing left, until I was empty and numb and could finally sleep. But there were also moments of unexpected beauty. A soldier who'd lost his leg learning to walk again. His face fierce with determination. A letter from home that made a dying man smile. The camaraderie among the staff, the way we supported each other. The dark humor we used to cope with the horror. The British nurse who taught me to make proper tea and told me stories about her childhood in Cornwall. The doctor who played violin in the evenings, filling the hospital with music that reminded us there was still beauty in the world. I was there for 8 months before I received new orders. We were being moved to a field hospital in France. The Allies had landed at Normandy in June, and now they were pushing inland, fighting for every mile. The field hospital would be mobile, moving forward as the troops advanced, always staying close enough to provide immediate care to the wounded. It would be dangerous. They made that very clear. We'd be working in tents, often within range of enemy artillery. We'd be subject to air raids. We might be captured if the lines shifted unexpectedly. Anyone who wanted to stay in England could do so without judgment. I volunteered immediately. I don't know why exactly. Maybe I'd become addicted to the intensity of it all, the sense of purpose, the feeling that what I was doing mattered in a tangible, immediate way. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, to push my limits and see what I was truly capable of. Maybe I was just tired of being safe while others were in danger. Whatever the reason, I found myself on a transport ship crossing the Channel, heading toward a war zone. France was devastated. The countryside we passed through was scarred with bomb craters and burned-out vehicles. Villages were reduced to rubble. The roads were clogged with military convoys and refugees, people fleeing the fighting with whatever they could carry. Children with hollow eyes. Old women pushing carts loaded with their remaining possessions. The smell of smoke and death hung over everything. Our field hospital was set up in a town called St. Lo, or what remained of it. The town had been almost completely destroyed in the fighting. 90% of the buildings were damaged or demolished. The cathedral stood like a skeleton, its walls intact but its roof gone, open to the sky. We pitched our tents in what had been a schoolyard, the ground still littered with children's toys and torn textbooks. It felt obscene somehow, setting up a hospital in a place where children had played, where life had been normal and innocent such a short time ago. The wounded came in a constant stream. Soldiers carried on stretchers by their comrades. Men who'd walked miles with injuries that should have killed them, driven by sheer will to reach help. The injuries were catastrophic. Burns that covered entire bodies. Limbs blown off. Abdominal wounds that spilled intestines. Head injuries that left men conscious but not quite human anymore. Their personalities erased by trauma. We worked in assembly line fashion, triaging, stabilizing, operating, moving them along to the next stage of care or, too often, covering them with a sheet and moving on to the next patient who might have a chance. I stopped thinking of them as individuals. I couldn't afford to. They became wounds to be treated, problems to be solved. An arterial bleed, collapsed lung, compound fracture. If I let myself think about who they were, about the mothers and wives and children waiting for them at home, I'd be paralyzed. So I focused on the task in front of me, on the immediate need, on doing my job as efficiently and effectively as possible. But sometimes, despite my best efforts, their humanity broke through. A boy, he couldn't have been more than 19, with a chest wound that was filling his lungs with blood. He grabbed my hand as I worked on him, his grip surprisingly strong, and he said, "Tell my mom I wasn't scared. Tell her I was brave." He died 3 minutes later, and I didn't even know his name, Didn't know how to find his mother to deliver that message. I carried that guilt with me, added it to the growing weight of all the other things I couldn't fix, couldn't save, couldn't make right. We'd been in St. Lo for 6 weeks when everything changed. It was late September, and the weather had turned cold and wet. Rain fell constantly, turning the ground to mud, making everything harder. The tents leaked. Our supplies were delayed by the weather and the damaged roads. We were running low on morphine, on plasma, on bandages. We were exhausted, all of us, running on coffee and adrenaline and the grim determination to keep going because stopping wasn't an option. The attack came at dawn. We heard the planes before we saw them, the distinctive whine of German Stukas. Then the bombs started falling. The ground shook with each impact. Dirt and debris rained down on us. The tent I was in took a direct hit on one corner, collapsing partially, trapping 2 nurses and several patients under canvas and poles. I could hear screaming, both from the wounded in the tent and from outside, where more bombs were falling. I don't remember making a conscious decision to act. My body simply moved. I started pulling at the collapsed canvas, trying to free the people trapped underneath. Others joined me, and together we managed to lift the heavy, wet fabric enough for people to crawl out. One of the nurses had a broken arm. Several patients had new injuries on top of their existing ones. But they were alive. The bombing continued. We could hear the whistle of falling bombs, the crump of explosions, some close, some farther away. The air was thick with smoke and dust. I helped move patients to a partially collapsed building that offered more protection than the tents. We carried them on stretchers, on our backs, however we could manage. Some of them were screaming in pain. Some were silent in shock. Some were already dead. But we carried them anyway because we didn't have time to check, didn't have time to sort the living from the dead. The building we'd chosen was the remains of a house, 3 walls still standing, the 4th blown away to reveal the interior like a dollhouse. We laid the patients on the floor, on pieces of canvas, on anything that would keep them off the cold ground. There was no electricity, no running water. We worked by the light coming through the missing wall and the holes in the roof. We used our dwindling supplies as carefully as we could, knowing we might not get more for days. The bombing lasted for 2 hours, though it felt like days. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise had been. We emerged from our shelter to find the field hospital destroyed. The tents were shredded, supplies scattered and ruined. Several vehicles were burning. And there were casualties among our own staff. 3 nurses dead. 2 doctors wounded. A chaplain who'd been trying to help evacuate patients caught in an explosion. We had no communication with headquarters. The radio had been destroyed. We had no way to call for help, no way to evacuate the wounded. And we had no idea if the Germans were planning a ground assault to follow up the bombing. We were on our own. The senior doctor, a man named Captain Morrison, gathered the remaining staff. There were 12 of us left who were uninjured enough to work. We had approximately 60 patients, many of them critical. We had minimal supplies and no shelter. The town was still burning in places, and we could hear small arms fire in the distance, though we couldn't tell if it was coming closer or moving away. "We need to move," Captain Morrison said. His face was gray with exhaustion and shock, but his voice was steady. "There's a church on the edge of town, stone construction, mostly intact. It's about half a mile from here. We'll move the patients there, set up a temporary hospital, and wait for relief." Half a mile. It doesn't sound like much, does it? But when you're carrying wounded men through rubble-strewn streets, when you're exhausted and scared and every shadow might hide an enemy soldier, half a mile becomes an odyssey. We started moving patients immediately. The ones who could walk we helped along, supporting them on either side. The ones who couldn't we carried on stretchers. We made trip after trip, back and forth, our muscles screaming, our lungs burning from the smoke-filled air. The streets were a nightmare to navigate. Rubble blocked some passages entirely. Others were cratered by bombs. Buildings that looked stable would suddenly shift and collapse, sending up clouds of dust and debris. I was carrying the front end of a stretcher, A soldier with both legs amputated below the knee, when we heard the sound of engines. Inks. We couldn't tell if they were ours or theirs. We froze, listening, trying to determine which direction the sound was coming from. The soldier on the stretcher looked up at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't let them take me," he whispered. "Please. I'd rather die." The tanks turned out to be American, a patrol that had gotten separated from their unit. They helped us move the remaining patients, using their vehicles to transport the most critical cases. The church Captain Morrison had mentioned was indeed still standing, a small stone structure with a bell tower that had somehow survived the bombing. The interior was cold and damp, the pews pushed to the sides to make room for our patients, but it was shelter and it was defensible. We worked through the night, doing what we could with what we had. We ran out of morphine entirely. Men screamed in pain, and all we could do was hold their hands and tell them lies about how they'd be fine, how help was coming soon. We ran out of plasma and watched men die from blood loss that we could have prevented if we'd had the supplies. We ran out of clean bandages and tore up our own clothes, our own sheets, anything we could find. I don't know how I kept going. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, moving through the motions while my mind retreated somewhere safe and distant. I stopped feeling tired. I stopped feeling scared. I stopped feeling anything at all. I just worked, moving from patient to patient, doing what needed to be done, not thinking about anything beyond the immediate task. Dawn came, gray and cold. The fighting had moved on, the sounds of battle now distant. We'd lost 8 more patients during the night, their bodies laid out in a side chapel, covered with whatever we could find. The survivors were stable, more or less. We'd done everything we could with nothing, and somehow most of them had made it through. I stepped outside the church as the sun was rising, needing air, needing a moment away from the suffering and the death. The town was still smoking, fires burning themselves out among the ruins. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, beautiful and indifferent to the horror below. I sat down on the church steps, and for the first time in 24 hours, I let myself feel. The exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. My hands started shaking and I couldn't make them stop. I put my head in my hands and cried, great gasping sobs that shook my entire body. That's when Captain Morrison found me. He sat down beside me, not saying anything, just present. After a while he spoke. "You saved a lot of lives yesterday, Dorothy. You know that, right? When the bombing started, when everything fell apart, you didn't freeze. You didn't panic. You just did what needed to be done. That's the definition of courage." I shook my head. I was terrified. I'm still terrified. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's acting despite the fear. You carried wounded men through burning streets while bombs were falling. You worked all night with no supplies and no sleep. You did things that most people couldn't do, wouldn't do. Don't diminish that. But I didn't feel courageous. Felt broken. I felt like I'd been shattered into pieces and poorly reassembled, with parts missing, with cracks that would never fully heal. I felt like I'd seen too much, done too much, lost too much of myself in the process. Relief arrived later that morning. A convoy of ambulances and supply trucks, escorted by a platoon of infantry. They evacuated our patients to a proper hospital farther behind the lines. They brought us food and water and clean clothes. They brought news that the front had moved forward, that we'd be relocating to a new position in a few days. They brought normalcy, or what passed for normalcy in a war zone. But something had changed in me during those 24 hours. I'd discovered a capacity for endurance I hadn't known I possessed. I'd learned that I could function in the worst possible circumstances, that I could make life-or-death decisions under pressure, that I could carry literal and figurative weight that should have crushed me. I'd learned that the labels people had put on me, fragile, delicate, soft, were wrong. Or maybe they'd been right once, but I'd been forged into something different by fire and blood and necessity. We moved to a new location, a town called Metz, and set up another field hospital. The work continued, the endless stream of wounded, the constant battle against death and suffering. But I approached it differently now. I was no longer the secretary from Brooklyn playing at being a nurse. I was a nurse, a good one, someone who could be counted on when things went wrong. I'd earned my place here, earned the respect of my colleagues, earned the right to be here doing this work. The war ground on. We moved with the troops as they pushed deeper into Germany. I saw things that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The concentration camps, the walking skeletons who were barely human anymore. The evidence of atrocities so vast and systematic that the mind couldn't fully comprehend them. The destroyed cities, the displaced millions, the children orphaned and traumatized. The cost of war measured not in territory gained or battles won, but in human suffering on a scale that defied understanding. But I also saw incredible acts of kindness and courage. Soldiers sharing their rations with starving civilians. Medics running into fire to save wounded comrades. People helping each other, protecting each other, maintaining their humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. I saw the best and worst of what humans are capable of, often in the same moment in the same place. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. I was in a field hospital in Bavaria when we got the news. Germany had surrendered. It was over. People cried and laughed and hugged each other. Someone found a bottle of champagne, and we passed it around, taking sips, toasting to peace, to survival, to going home. But the celebration felt muted somehow. We were too tired, had seen too much. And we knew that while the war in Europe was over, the war in the Pacific continued. Men were still dying. The work wasn't finished. I stayed in Germany for 3 more months, helping with the massive effort to care for displaced persons and liberated prisoners. Then, finally, I received my orders to return home. I boarded a ship in Southampton, the same port where I'd arrived 3 years earlier, and crossed the Atlantic again. This time, there were no U-boats to fear, no convoys, no destroyers. Just a ship full of soldiers and nurses and support staff, all of us going home, all of us changed in ways we were only beginning to understand. New York Harbor appeared through the morning mist, the Statue of Liberty raising her torch, welcoming us home. I stood at the rail with hundreds of others, watching the city grow larger as we approached. I should have been excited, relieved, happy. But I felt strangely disconnected, like I was watching someone else's homecoming, not my own. The person who'd left New York 3 years ago no longer existed. I didn't know who I was now, didn't know how to be Dorothy Mae Harrison, secretary, daughter, sister, when I'd spent 3 years being someone else entirely. My mother and Evelyn were waiting at the dock. I saw them in the crowd, my mother's hair grayer than I remembered, Evelyn taller, more grown up. They waved frantically when they spotted me, and I waved back, trying to smile, trying to feel the joy I knew I should feel. They hugged me so tightly when I finally reached them, both of them crying, both of them talking at once, telling me how much they'd missed me, how worried they'd been, how glad they were that I was home safe. But I wasn't safe, not really. Part of me was still in France, still in that church in St. Lo, still carrying wounded soldiers through burning streets. Part of me would always be there, would never come home. The adjustment to civilian life was harder than I'd anticipated. Everything seemed trivial, meaningless. People complained about rationing, about shortages, about inconveniences that seemed laughable compared to what I'd seen. They asked me about the war, but they didn't really want to know. They wanted sanitized stories, heroic tales, not the truth about what war actually was. So I learned to smile and nod and tell them what they wanted to hear, while the real stories stayed locked inside me, too heavy and dark to share. I tried to go back to my old job at the law firm, but I lasted less than a week. I couldn't sit at a desk typing letters about contracts and property disputes. It felt like a waste, like I was squandering skills and experience that had been bought at such a high price. I needed to do something that mattered, something that used what I'd learned. I enrolled in nursing school, a real program this time, not an accelerated wartime course. I used the GI Bill to pay for it, one of the few benefits extended to women who'd served. The coursework was easy after what I'd experienced. The other students, fresh out of high school, complained about the difficulty, about the long hours, about the stress. I said nothing, just did the work, aced the exams, completed my clinical rotations with a competence that made my instructors take notice. I graduated at the top of my class and took a job at Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan, working in the emergency department. It was the closest thing to the intensity of the field hospital, the constant flow of patients, the need to make quick decisions, the variety of cases. I was good at it. I thrived in the chaos that made other nurses anxious. I could handle the trauma cases, the difficult patients, the situations that required someone who could stay calm under pressure. But I was also difficult to work with, I know that now. I had no patience for inefficiency, for hesitation, for people who couldn't handle the stress. I was hard on the younger nurses, demanding, critical. I didn't know how to be gentle anymore. Didn't know how to make allowances for normal human weakness. I'd been forged in fire, and I expected everyone else to be equally strong, equally capable. It wasn't fair, but I didn't know how else to be. Years passed. I worked, I came home to the apartment I now shared with just my mother, Evelyn having married and moved to New Jersey. I existed, but I didn't really live. I had no close friends, no romantic relationships. I dated a few times, but it never went anywhere. How could I explain to someone over dinner what I'd seen, what I'd done, who I really was? The gap between my external life and my internal reality was too vast to bridge. I had nightmares, vivid and recurring. I'd wake up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, the images from my dreams, burning buildings, screaming men, blood on my hands, so real I could smell them. I'd get up and sit by the window, watching the city sleep, waiting for dawn, afraid to go back to sleep and return to those dreams. I didn't talk about the war. When people asked, I gave brief, vague answers and changed the subject. My mother knew better than to push. She'd seen me come home, had watched me struggle, and she understood in her own way that some things were too painful to discuss. She just loved me, fed me, worried about me, and gave me space to heal in my own time, in my own way. It took years, decades really, before I could begin to process what I'd experienced. The nightmares gradually became less frequent. The hypervigilance, the constant state of alertness, slowly eased. I learned to be a little gentler, a little more patient, a little more human. I learned to let people in, just a little, just enough to not be completely alone. I retired from nursing at 65, after 40 years in the profession. My colleagues threw me a party, gave me a plaque, made speeches about my dedication and skill. They called me a legend, said I'd trained half the nurses in the hospital, said I'd saved countless lives. They didn't know the half of it. They didn't know about St. Lo, about carrying wounded soldiers through burning streets, about working all night with no supplies while bombs fell around us. They knew the nurse I'd become, but not the girl I'd been or the crucible that had transformed one into the other. My mother passed away when I was 68, peacefully in her sleep, the way my father had gone. I held her hand as she took her last breath, and I was grateful that I could be there, that I could give her that comfort, that I'd survived the war and come home to her even if I'd come home changed. Evelyn and I grew closer after that, two sisters who'd taken very different paths but who shared a history, a foundation, a love that transcended the differences. I'm 93 years old now. I live in a small apartment in Queens, not far from where I grew up. My body has betrayed me in the ways bodies do when they've been used hard and lived long. My hands, those hands that were once so steady, now shake with palsy. My back, which carried so much weight, is bent and painful. My eyes, which saw so much, are dimming with cataracts. But my mind is still sharp, still full of memories, still processing experiences from 7 decades ago. I think about the war often now, more than I did in the years immediately after. I think about the soldiers I treated, wonder what happened to the ones who survived, whether they went on to live full lives or whether they, like me, were forever marked by what they'd experienced. I think about my colleagues, the nurses and doctors I worked alongside, some of whom didn't make it home. I think about the girl I was, Dorothy Mae Harrison, 23 years old, taking the subway to her secretary job, thinking that was all her life would ever be. They told me I was too fragile for war, too delicate, too soft. They were wrong. Or maybe they were right, and the war burned away that fragility, leaving something harder, stronger, more resilient. I don't know. What I do know is that I survived. I did my job, saved lives. I carried wounded soldiers through burning streets when bombs were falling and the world was ending, and I didn't break. Bent certainly. I was damaged, undoubtedly. But I didn't break. I don't tell this story to glorify war. War is horror pure and simple. It destroys everything it touches, leaves scars that never fully heal, creates suffering on a scale that should shame our entire species. I don't tell this story to make myself seem heroic. I did what needed to be done, what thousands of other women did, what circumstances demanded. We weren't heroes. We were just people trying to help, trying to make a difference, trying to save lives in a world dedicated to taking them. I tell this story because it's true. 'Cause it happened. 'Cause I was there. Because the girl everyone said was too fragile proved them wrong. Proved that strength comes in forms we don't always recognize, that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. I tell this story because I want people to know that women were there, in the war zones, in the field hospitals, carrying wounded soldiers through burning streets, doing work that was dangerous and difficult and essential. I tell this story because I'm 93 years old, and soon I won't be here to tell it anymore. The generation that fought that war is disappearing, a few more of us dying every day, taking our stories with us. Soon World War II will be nothing but history books and documentaries, dates and statistics, the human reality of it lost to time. I want to leave this record, this testimony, this truth. I was there. I saw it. I lived it. And it changed me forever. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I stand at my window and look out at the city. The lights stretch out in every direction, millions of people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, facing their own challenges. Most of them have never known war, never had to carry wounded soldiers through burning streets, never had to choose who lives and who dies because there aren't enough supplies to save everyone. That's good. That's how it should be. That's what we fought for, so that future generations wouldn't have to experience what we experienced. But I also worry that they don't understand the cost. That they take their peace for granted, don't realize how fragile it is, how quickly civilization can collapse into chaos and violence. I worry that the lessons we learned, the terrible knowledge we gained, will be lost, and humanity will have to learn them all over again. I was branded too fragile for war. But I went anyway. I did the work, carried the weight. I survived. And in surviving, in enduring, in refusing to break no matter what was thrown at me, I discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. Not physical strength, though I developed that too. But a deeper strength, a strength of will, of spirit, of determination. The strength to keep going when everything in you wants to stop. The strength to care when caring hurts. The strength to remain human in circumstances designed to strip away your humanity. That's what I want people to understand. That's what I want to leave behind. Not that war is glorious or heroic, because it isn't. But that humans are capable of incredible things, both terrible and wonderful. That we can endure more than we think we can. That we can find strength in ourselves we didn't know existed. That we can carry wounded soldiers through burning streets, literally and metaphorically, when the situation demands it. I was Dorothy Mae Harrison, secretary from Brooklyn, too fragile for war. I became Dorothy Mae Harrison, nurse, veteran, survivor, someone who discovered that fragility and strength aren't opposites but can coexist in the same person, in the same moment. I became someone who carried wounded soldiers through burning streets and lived to tell about it. And now I've told it. This is my story. This is my truth. This is what happened to the girl everyone said was too delicate, too soft, too fragile. She went to war. She did her job. She came home changed. She lived a long life, a good life in many ways, though forever marked by what she'd seen and done. She's 93 years old now, and she's tired, so very tired. But she's still here, still standing, still strong in the ways that matter. They said I was too fragile. They were wrong. And I have the scars, the memories, and the 93 years of life to prove it.